Parshas Behaaloscha, Tov Ayin Vav. We're here once again at Mikro Cholim headquarters of Lakewood, New Jersey. Every once in a while, I'd like to thank our hosts for giving us such a beautiful place and such delicious tayamel. Every week after the shir, I wanted to thank Shmuley personally for always being so gracious and bringing out trays and trays of cholent before we even get here. It's all waiting for us already. And, okay, now let's get into the parsha. The Torah tells us, near the end of our parsha, we should know Parshas Behaaloscha is so full of things to talk about, starting with the menorah and going through the way that the Klal Yisrael traveled in the Midbar and how they were told to travel and in what order they traveled. I actually heard something very interesting tonight. Someone mentioned that the parsha of how to go, Al Pi Hashem Yachanu, Al Pi Hashem Yisod, that parsha most of the time comes out the week right before summer vacations. So before summer vacations, we're told Al Pi Hashem Yachanu, Al Pi Hashem Yisod, that all your travels have to be like a yid, and all your travels have to be with Kiddush Hashem. But that's something else, and we're not really going to get into that tonight. So in our parsha, we want to discuss this week, the Torah tells us that Moshe Rabbeinu was the ultimate honor, the ultimate humble person, and the pasuk tells us, "V'ha'ish Moshe onav me'oi mikol ha'adam asher al pnei ha'adamah." Moshe Rabbeinu was the biggest honor, the most humble person to walk the face of the earth. And the Gemara in Chulin Daf Peites Amud Aleph tells us that what the Torah tells us about Moshe Rabbeinu in our parsha is even greater than that which is said about Avraham Avinu. By Avraham Avinu, the pasuk tells us that Avraham Avinu said, "V'anoichi afar v'efer." Avraham Avinu said, "I am afar and efer." And Moshe Rabbeinu said in our parsha, "The nachanu ma," that we're not even, don't even exist. So the Gemara tells us that what's said as far as being humble, as far as being low, what's said about Moshe Rabbeinu is even greater than what is said about Avraham Avinu. So really we need to explain, says the Nesivos Shalom, what it means when the Torah tells us that Moshe Rabbeinu felt that he was nothing. What does that mean? So let's understand something right away. It is clear that Moshe Rabbeinu definitely knew his madrega. Don't think for a second that Moshe Rabbeinu did not know himself and that Moshe Rabbeinu did not know where he was holding. Moshe Rabbeinu knew exactly how great he was. The Torah says about Moshe Rabbeinu is the one who brought the Torah. And the Torah says about Moshe Rabbeinu, "V'loikam navi oid k'Moshe," that there will never, was never, and will never be a Navi like Moshe Rabbeinu, Asher Yidoi Hashem Panim al Panim. Moshe Rabbeinu, so to speak, Kaviyachol, had face-to-face conversations with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Moshe Rabbeinu spoke to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So Moshe Rabbeinu, of course, was on an extremely, extremely high level, and Moshe Rabbeinu knew it. So how was it that Moshe Rabbeinu became such an honor? How was it? How is it possible that a person who is the greatest person to walk the face of the earth also got the title of the person who was most humble? I mean, if we look around, if we think about just us in our generation, generally those things don't go together. You'll have maybe sometimes a great person that's humble, but the greatest person should be the most humble person, and that was Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu, we know, reached heights that nobody had ever reached and nobody will ever reach again. So Nesivos Shalom explains with an analogy. He says like this: imagine that you have a full bucket of water. Now that bucket of water if you're carrying an individual bucket of water, it has real value, right? You can take that water on a hot day, it's worth a lot to you. Drink it, and you can sell it, whatever you can do with water, but that individual bucket has real value. Says in Nesivos Shalom, now take that same bucket of water, go down to the ocean and pour it into the water. All of a sudden, basically, the water that you had in that bucket, that it was worth something just a moment before that. But you take that water and you pour it into the ocean, in a second, it basically becomes worthless. In just 1 second. And it's not even recognizable. We don't even recognize what we had a moment before that. And even if you took 1,000 buckets of water, one we said has value. If you took 1,000 buckets of water and poured it into the Atlantic Ocean, what do you have? You have nothing. It's worthless. It's basically not recognizable at all in the ocean. So when something stands alone, it has a metzius, it has a worth. Yet, when you take the same thing and you pour it into something that's so vast and so great, like the ocean, it becomes overwhelmed and it has no value. It says in the Nesivos Shalom, when a Jew connects themselves to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when a person connects himself to Hashem, he is, so to speak, in the ocean. What is a person next to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? And he has no value in relevance to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So now let's understand Moshe Rabbeinu. We want to understand how it came to be that Moshe Rabbeinu became such a humble person, such a great honor. Moshe Rabbeinu was the most connected person to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Moshe Rabbeinu was so connected to and so mevatel himself to Hashem. Therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu was that much greater. He was a greater anav than anyone else because Moshe Rabbeinu understood. The more you understood how great HaKadosh Baruch Hu is, the bigger the ocean, so to speak, the more you understand how insignificant anything of individual value has in that vast sea of godliness, in that vast sea of Hashem. So Avraham Avinu was a tremendously humble person. Avraham Avinu said, "V'anochi afar v'efer." I'm like dust, I'm like dirt. Anochi afar v'efer. But although he was afar v'efer, which is basically without value, but there's still something. If I show you a bucket of sand, if I show you sand, it still has value. Anochi afar v'efer, it's very low, but it's still there. It still has something. Moshe Rabbeinu was even past that. Moshe Rabbeinu said, "V'nachnu ma." We're not even that. We're nothing. Moshe Rabbeinu felt he was nothing, that there's no individual value. Moshe Rabbeinu knew better than everybody else just how great Hashem was. So the greater you are and the closer you are to Hashem, the easier it is to be a humble person. Sometimes you see a person that has trouble being humble. Maybe they're not close enough to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Because we learn from Moshe Rabbeinu that the closer you are to Hashem, the closer one is connected to Hashem, the closer and the better someone actually knows Hashem Kaviyachol, the easier it is and the more incumbent it is on the person to be humble. And because Moshe Rabbeinu was so great and he was able to speak with Hashem, Moshe Rabbeinu was that much of an anav. Imagine a person that finally, he's been trying for years, and he finally makes it up to the palace of the king. He's trying to get an audience with the king, trying to be able to get into inner chambers of the king. Finally, after all these years, he gets up to the king. And what does he see? He comes into the palace of the king. He comes into the place where the king is, and he sees that everybody around the king has such respect and such fear of the king. And what does he see? When he gets closer, he sees in relativity to the king, everything else seems so small. and everything else seems so insignificant. So while he was begging for an audience with the king before he was able to get there, so he thought he knew, and when you don't identify with something personally, but once he gets to the king himself, and he sees how insignificant everything else, once he gets a direct audience, then you know that once next to the grandeur of the king, from up close, you begin to appreciate it, and you understand how little everything else is next to the king. So Moshe Rabbeinu was the biggest honor. Why? Because he was able to see the greatness of Hashem from up close. The Nesivos Shalom says that there is a time that we can actually practice this. Nobody here is going to be Moshe Rabbeinu. No one here is Moshe Rabbeinu. But how do we try to get a little feeling of this feeling of being close to Hashem and being humble about it? Nesivos Shalom says the time that every person could feel, may aim this, to feel a little of this, is on Shabbos Kodesh. The Pasuk tells us, Sheishes Yomim Tavoid, work for 6 days, but on those 6 days you do all your work. The Yom Hashvi'i Shabbos Lashem Alekecha. The 7th day is Shabbos Lashem Alekecha. For 6 days, the Nesivos Shalom translates the pasuk, and he darshans on the pasuk in a very beautiful way. He says, for 6 days, we need to work on all the mitzvahs. Sheishes yomim tavoid v'asisa kol malachtecha. For 6 days, you work, and you work on all your mitzvahs. But the Yom HaShvi'i, on the 7th day, Shabbos Lashem Alekecha. It's a day for us to be close to Hashem, and the closer we are to Hashem, the more we're mevatel ourselves to Hashem. He darshans that, he learns it beautifully from that pasuk of working for 6 days, but the Yom HaShvi'i Lashem Alekecha. It's the time to slow down and think about Hashem, to think how close we want to be to Hashem, to think how close we are to Hashem. It's a day to be mevatel ourselves to Hashem, and when we get to the point where we're completely and totally realizing the greatness of Hashem, and that is only really on Shabbos Kodesh. So the lesson of Moshe Rabbeinu, and the Torah is full of lessons. It's not some historical thing. The lesson of Moshe Rabbeinu is that every person could learn to be humble. Every person learns from Moshe Rabbeinu, who was so great, and the greater he was, the more humble he was. And that's the lesson every single one of us can take, and we can start on this Shabbos Parshas Behaaloscha, where it's in our Parsha, to understand that no matter how great a person thinks they are, no matter how much they learn, no matter how much they do in their lives, it is still the greatest thing to be humble. And the way to become more humble is to be closer to Hashem. The closer you are to Hashem, the more you feel Hashem, the more you live with Hashem in your life. The lesson that Moshe Rabbeinu teaches us is that is how a person becomes an Anav, and that is really what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to see.